On April 28, 2023, the Indian Defence Minister, Mr. Rajnath Singh met his Chinese counterpart, Mr. Li Shangfu, in the Indian capital city of New Delhi. The Chinese side appeared to be carrying a hope of issuing a joint statement filled with optimism at the end of the meeting. But the Indian side will have none of it. The Indian Defence Minister instead stated that the border violations by the Chinese army has eroded the entire basis of relations between India and China. If China had hoped for some reconciliation, India was not willing to offer one bit. There are valid reasons why India will refuse to provide any conciliatory tone to China. The Chinese aggression into Indian territory, known as Galwan Valley, in June 2020, which killed 20 Indian soldiers, completely destroyed any trust by the Indian government and its people towards China. It also made China an intentional violator of bilateral agreements between the two countries. According to Western intelligence inputs, India had given a befitting response in that conflict by killing about 45 of the Chinese army men. This caused huge embarrassment for China, and it tried its best to hide it from its own citizens. Though the Chinese social media had several posts where mass graves of the fallen soldiers were shared among the Chinese citizenry. Since the incident in June 2020, both the Chinese and Indian military have been building up their forces in the long border region that separates them. The Chinese had built up excellent infrastructure on their side, and India has been working on a breakneck speed to catch up with China. The Indian military infrastructure has significantly improved, and the current Indian government has been quite strong with their response. In this backdrop, there have been several rounds of negotiations between the two sides to withdraw their soldiers from the tense standoff, and have the Chinese move back from any posts that they have built near the Indian border. The talks seem to have made breakthrough after 19 rounds, but it didn't lead to peace to the extent of how things were before the conflict. With all its problems with India, China has a bigger problem in the geopolitical arena. In the recent past, China has been actively involved in a war game with the US and its allies. They have also been showing a high degree of belligerence with Taiwan. If China engages in any sort of conflict with either the US, Japan, or South Korea, or any other Western ally, they'll want their border with India to be quiet and peaceful. China is in no position to wage war on two fronts, especially with a powerful Indian military force, who have an advantage of being better trained in mountain warfare than the Chinese. The Chinese have been trying to give an appearance that they can move past the recent aggression and the military build-up against India, but India is not buying the bluff. When the Indian and Chinese foreign ministers met on March 2023, the Chinese foreign minister, Qin Gang, tried to downplay the differences on the border, but the Indian counterpart, Mr. Jaishankar, was blunt with his message that the relationship cannot be improved unless the situation on the border is resolved. The recent meeting of the defense ministers has reconfirmed the firm stand taken by India in deflecting the Chinese attempt of a pretentious peace with India, while the border is still tense. In its recent history, India had always hoped for an elusive peace with China, but China doesn't seem to have wanted it. The country of Tibet used to be the buffer zone between India and China, and India had a wonderful relationship with the peaceful people of Tibet. Tibet had agreed with treaties on the border with India. But things changed when China attacked and captured Tibet in 1959. After the Chinese military annexation of Tibet, India became a neighbor to China. But China refused to accept the borders what has been agreed between Tibet and India. China has a habit of unilaterally claiming land that it covets as its own, and refusing to accept the boundaries that exist between the two nations. After a war with China in 1962, India has tried to engage in many dialogues and sign multiple agreements to maintain peace on its borders. These agreements were signed between the two nations to prevent any military confrontation, starting with the one signed in 1975. The 1993 agreement, known as Border Peace and Tranquility Agreement, or BPTA for short, aimed at preventing the soldiers patrolling the border on both sides not to carry weapons, along the line of actual control in the India-China border areas. In 1996, there was another agreement signed between the two nations as part of the confidence-building measures. The problem has been, China didn't seem to care for these agreements, though they are UN-approved and internationally recognized written agreements. Their greed for land grab and aggression had made them ignore the international conventions on respecting even formal treaties. When China unilaterally engaged in an unexpected armed conflict with India, in June 2020, it violated several agreements signed with India, including the 1993 agreement. Article 1 and 3 of the 1996 agreements, Article 1 of the 2005 agreement, Article 8 of the 2013 agreement, as well as Article 2 of the UN Charter. If you dig into the details of China's behavior, you'll find a pattern how they have not respected international agreements with many nations both on the land and on the sea. However, things were not always hostile between the two giants from a historical perspective. India and China are two great civilizations, not just two neighboring countries. They have maintained good relationship for several centuries. But things changed between the two countries since the Communist Party of China, known as CPC or more commonly as CCP, took over China in 1949. The CCP as a party and as a government machinery has routinely abused any trust that other countries had placed on them. Being well aware of China's behavior, India on its part has tried its very best to maintain some level of peace with its aggressive and expansionist neighbor. However, it has not helped in resolving the border issues between the two countries. If China cares for real peace with its neighbors including India, it could have easily achieved that. But it never did. China has always wanted to buy time to grow in military strength so that they increase their bargaining position in negotiations. This strategy of China may backfire in a big way with India. India has been growing leaps and bounds in the recent past, both economically and militarily, and has a demographic advantage over China. China, on its side, seems to be losing its human resources due to its one-child policy, and is also reeling under massive debt. It's quite possible India may become a larger economy than China in the next 2 decades, and may have a much better military force than China. China may have missed the opportunity to strike a peace deal with India when China was still at its peak, and may regret this mistake in the decades to come. Thanks for watching.